It is big, it's bold, it's filled with promise and pitfalls. Paul McKee's Northside Regeneration Project is about to get underway, and for us, it's just the starting point for a lot of talk about projects, profits, and people.
And on Stay Tuned, you drive the discussion. We bring local experts, journalists, and civic leaders together to have tough conversations for a stronger St. Louis. Tweet us your insights on tonight's topic, and you've got a seat at the table. With a few national experts and a panel of community members, this is the show bringing more light and less heat to the issues that matter. So stay tuned.
I'm Jim Kircher. I'm filling in for Casey Nolan this month. He is in Russia, believe it or not, covering the Olympics. For us, though, we're staying close to home. We're talking about big changes in the city. I'll be honest with you, over the years that I've been in St. Louis, we've talked a lot about big changes and big plans. Some of them have fallen through, as surprisingly, I think a lot of them have succeeded, and sometimes they don't get the full credit. We're talking about this North Side regeneration with Tim Logan from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. But in all the years that I've covered stuff that has fallen through, has succeeded, I've never seen anything like this.
This is bigger than anything that I've ever covered, or this is an enormous project.
And different than anything.
Different, yeah. Paul McKee, developer of a long time around here, wants to remake 2 square miles of North St. Louis, north of downtown. It's a project that's hard to put numbers on because it's so big, but he's talking about tens of thousands of new houses and maybe $8 billion worth of development over 1,500 square miles over 20 miles over 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, acres, huge stuff. Now, a lot of the coverage, it began as what's going on, who's behind it. Then there were the legal battles, the political battles. But at this point, we're really talking about something happening, right?
Hopefully. This spring, this summer, McKee says he wants to start street work on Jefferson Avenue and on Cass Avenue and start development here. Finally.
Yeah, so we should be looking at that. I think one of the reasons there's so much talk about this is because we're not really talking about a project in an area. We're talking about lots of projects in lots of areas. And when we went up there, I think that's why we found so many people with so many more questions than answers at this point. What does he own around here?
Around here, he owns that property, and he owns the property behind.
Right here, he owns that. Right there, he's just bought. Right down there, he's just bought.
Behind, we own that lot, except for.
Paul McKee doesn't own everything in his North Side regeneration area, but he's just about everybody's neighbor. The question is, how good of a neighbor is he going to be?
So I want to know what's going to happen there, and I don't know that he knows at this point.
This project is so big, it covers so much ground. He spent years secretly buying pieces of property, that's often the way big developers work, and assembled a lot of land before people began to realize that somebody was up to something big. The somebody was Paul McKee, a successful suburban developer. The something big? Well, that's something of a big question, now that McKee has jumped many of the legal and political hurdles and is ready to start. If you're looking for something to happen soon, look to the new Stan Musial Veterans Bridge, where it lands in the city just north of downtown.
Yeah, the interchange is right over here, just, almost could throw a rock at it, where that stoplight is. Right. That's the
Around here, it's not so much about housing as it is about business. And the owner of the Gateway Auto Repair Shop on 13th Street is glad the long wait is over.
Basically, I'm looking at a lot of new, maybe like a Quick Trip down here, maybe an IGA store they're talking about, new properties, they're talking about fixing some roads up, and there's going to be 4 sections of the McGee project, which is A, B, C, and D. This one's A. This is the first one they're going to break ground on, and it's supposed to go June 6th.
Buying land around a new, busy interchange, that seems like a smart business investment. Buying lots of land in a depressed urban environment, that's really the part that has people wondering and hoping that McKee means what he says.
I see a lot of people happy, a lot of people moving here, a lot of the existing people having opportunity for jobs. There's not a supermarket within 7.5 miles, so I see that coming back. I see green
McKee is
space,
talking
so-
about doing a lot of things: new businesses, new jobs, new housing, bringing back an area that long ago began to lose jobs and population. It has a lot of empty lots and abandoned buildings, but it also has some new housing and some industry. It is not empty, but it is predominantly African American. And when white people come in with big plans for a black neighborhood, that brings back memories. In the 1950s, the densely populated Mill Creek neighborhood was cleared. People were relocated for commercial and industrial development that just didn't happen as promised. And while there are a lot of important ways that this is not the same story, it still makes a lot of people uneasy.
I grew up in Mill Creek. My family grew up in Mill Creek. We have a long history.
Lois Connolly is the founder and director of the Griot Museum of Black History on St. Louis Avenue. So the talk of what Paul McKee would like to do here, how did you first react when you heard what was going on?
Actually, with mixed emotions, because I've had some experiences both as being moved out of a neighborhood, out of a community because of a redevelopment project, and also working for a developer. I can't be angry at him or any developer who wants to make the area better.
We look at that burned out building over there.
Good Lord, it needs to come down. But next to it are people who live in those houses
That's a
who
beautiful
have been
house.
there for years.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
so what happens to those people? And I'm sure there's some concern on their part. You feel a little less intimidated if you're a part of the process and you have some input. Yeah. But when people just sort of feed it to you and you have no decision making, it's a little harder to swallow.
McKee has met with community members since the plan became public. He says he's working with and in the interests of the people who live here. But there are really lots of areas involved and lots of interests. Some people, for example, want to know if and when McKee will save the historic Clemens House. Something will have to be done soon if it's not already too late. But this is a long-term project, longer than the 10 years it took to assemble all the land. And a lot of the early work will focus on infrastructure, which means that change won't look much like change, except in a few places, like the New Bridge interchange north of downtown.
Most of the businesses I'm talking to, they're happy. The north side's getting rebuilt. You know, there was like a tunnel over here that's already gotten filled up. The neighborhood, I've been on here 25 years. It is so much better than it used to be, and it's just getting better and better as it goes. That's what I see.
Now, Paul McKee had agreed earlier to be our first guest tonight. He had to cancel. I hope we can reschedule him for another show. The point is, people might be wondering, well, he's ducking us, but I don't think, from what I've been seeing, Paul McKee is ducking anybody anymore.
No, he was definitely doing this behind closed doors for a long time, but for the last 4 years or so, he's been pretty open. He's done he's done his share of trips to City Hall and public hearings, and he's done a lot of meetings in the community. There's still people who have a lot of questions, though, so he has a lot of work to do ahead as far as public outreach.
Well, what are the questions you're most commonly hearing?
What does he want to do to our neighborhood?
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
as you said in the piece, this is not an empty place. There are thousands of people who live here, and there's still a lot of uncertainty about what this is going to mean for them.
Yeah, and again, the history here, and I think in a lot of other cities, has been pretty clear. People feel they're going to be pushed out. Let's talk a little bit, and we can talk about this with some of the other folks, but people have asked for guarantees and promises about you won't push people out. There won't be mass dislocation, relocation. Can he live up to those promises?
I think he has to. If he does any sort of eminent domain or removal of residents in any large scale, he's going to get killed in public opinion, because he said that over and over and over again, that he wants everybody who's there to stay. And there's no, as of now in the development agreement, there's no eminent domain on homeowners. So those things, there are protections in there. And yeah, that could get undone later, but it would be a loud thing if that happened.
So let me ask, and this is the thing that I was wondering, and I was going to ask Paul McKee, what's the business plan here? I mean, there's a big investment, there's a lot of money at stake, there's a lot of TIF money at stake going into this. how is this supposed to pay off? I don't mean for us in the
Right.
community, I mean for him.
And there is a lot of public money. There's also a lot of private money in this, a lot of McKee's money and his investors. I think this pays off basically by McKee accumulating decent-sized chunks of ground all over this area and selling it off to partners. Now, those partners could be somebody who wants to build an office building. They could be somebody who wants to build a gas station. They could be somebody who wants to build several blocks worth of new housing. He's assembling land in developable chunks. He's improving the infrastructure around it, and then he's going to partner or sell, or do himself, but largely partner and sell with other entities. That's what he's always said. He's a builder, but he's not the only builder in this. There's going to be a lot of partners.
Yeah, there are other people in this, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later. But I think one of the concerns has been there's this one guy sitting at the top of this pyramid.
Yes, there is. And McKee's job in this,
And by pyramid, I don't mean that in a business sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I mean, he's sort of the master developer in this. It's his job to create the environment in which this more stuff can happen. That's how he sees it anyways. Other people would disagree with that approach, but that's how he sees it. He's the guy who's going to take all the hits. He's going to clear the ground. He's going to create the political environment, the economic environment, the infrastructure environment for development to happen in these neighborhoods. But yeah, he's the guy at the top of the pyramid.
So I know you're not a psychologist, but you got to wonder what's behind this. This is a guy who did very well in suburban development.
Yep.
Could have probably continued to do well, doing what he knew how to do. Do you get a sense of what drives him to do this particular project when there are probably easier projects to do?
That's an interesting question. He's not a young man, and he's spent 10 years on this already, and it's not even begun yet. I do think he's sincere. I think he wants to bring what he sees as better things to North St. Louis. I think some people might question the way he's doing it, but I think he's sincerely motivated to do something really big, and remake this chunk of the city. Now, whether he pulls it off or not, whether it's too much to bite off, we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, and again, I made the point because when people say infrastructure, people want, they want groundbreakings and they want, bricks and mortar.
Yeah.
But if you're seriously going to address an urban area, you really have to address infrastructure, and that ain't sexy.
No, it's not. Yeah, nobody gets that fired up about sewers and road work, but it does matter.
But is the step? I know he's talked about the bridge, some of the
Yep.
stuff by the
Yep.
bridge, which again, that's an intersection.
Right.
It's a good place to go. He's talked about Jefferson and Cass. The 22nd Street
22nd Street interchange. Yep.
which is another interesting part of this because now we're funneling things.
See a
into-
triangle there, don't you?
Yeah.
So no, I mean, he will say that the way to, I mean, I've heard him say this countless times, the way I know how to create jobs is to assemble land. And the way that you then make that land attractive is by improving the roads. It's it may not be the most progressive approach to urban development in 2014, but it's an approach, and it works in some climates, and we'll see if it works here.
Yeah, great. And I think we'll, obviously everybody's going to keep an eye on this. So stick around. You can join the conversation on Twitter, #StayTunedSTL. We'll be right back to get deeper into some of these issues. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, let's get the journalists out of the way and let's get some opinions going here. Joining me is Lois Conley from the Griot Museum of Black History. She was in the piece we just did, and I was impressed enough. I said, well, let's bring her on the table because I think she's got more to say. Michael Allen, he's been on the show before, director of the Preservation Research Office, also at the very beginning of this story, digging into what was going on and why it was going on. And Sal Martinez, executive director of Community Renewal and Development Incorporated. Michael, I'm going to start with you, in part because you started to piece things together early on. Some of the criticisms, some of the concerns. Obviously, I said there's promise, there's pitfalls here. there's also a lot of concerns. Let's lay out some of those concerns.
Right. I think the size of the project, the amount of subsidy, the track record of large subsidized projects. I mean, the last time a large amount of money was spent in this part of North St. Louis with a big amount of clearance, we got Pruitt-Igoe. Not exactly the poster child of success. Coupled with that was the acquisition, the neglect of historic buildings, tactics of buying up blocks that some people called block busting, the threat of eminent domain, concerns about the historic preservation of important buildings, and encroachment upon pockets of growth. I mean, we saw in the 2010 census that the north side neighborhood growing the fastest was Old North St. Louis. And St. Louis Place, actually, to its credit, was right behind there. All this was happening without this project. So people in those communities who were part of more grassroots organic efforts thought, is this thing going to knock us out of the water?
So I get these concerns, and I mean, I think about these things, and I think about a groundbreaking on the Bottle District. I'm always distrustful of artists' renditions of anything because any artist can draw anything about anything, right? And that's a different kind of a story. So let me ask you guys to weigh in a little bit. I get the concerns. Do you see specific reasons to think that some of those concerns will be played out? Or is Paul McKee addressing some of those answers?
Well, I think Paul McKee is very serious about his intent to redevelop this area in question. And personally, I've seen developments not nearly as big as this, but developments that dare to dream about a better community come to fruition. I've had the pleasure of serving as chairman of the St. Louis Housing Authority for almost a decade. And there was a development called Renaissance Place at Grand that was built about 10 years ago. And people said the old Blumeyer housing development, that community could never be revitalized and redeveloped. And through grassroots organizing, bringing in public resources and private investment, we were able to transform that community to a healthy, vibrant area. And I think we can replicate that on a much larger scale with Northside Regeneration, working with Paul McKee, the residents and the stakeholders in the community.
The question always is, and Los, I'm going to ask you this, is he listening?
I think he's listening. I've personally been in a number of community meetings with Paul. I was with Paul today. I'm a member of the Northside Workforce Coalition, and so there were several agencies that are part of that, Slate, Better Family Life, Rankin Tech, and many others. And so we're talking about creating boots on the ground opportunities and opportunities for minority and women-owned companies. And he understands and has embraced the ideal of grassroots development. Lois,
your museum is right there on St. Louis Avenue. You're sort of in the middle of things as we were walking around the museum and pointing out some of the really nice remaining buildings, visually nice. I don't know how they are inside. I don't know how the plumbing and the electric work is. But other things that clearly you said, this has to go. I'll ask you the same question. Do you get a sense that Paul McKee is listening to the community? Because that's what people were saying. You can't come in here without listening to us.
I think that he is listening. I don't know that he listens often enough. I don't think he is as approachable as he could be with individuals. Group meetings and public hearings are great, but I think there are people who would prefer to have had more individual meetings with him. I do think, however, that he is sincere in his intent, as Sal has said, to try to do a good job for the community as a whole. And when you do that in such a large project, there's certainly going to be some people who are not going to be happy. There are going to be some people who are going to come out in a way that they had not hoped to come out. They are going to have to move. They are going to lose some properties. But in the larger scheme of things, I think the project that he is proposing is a good one. It is frightening and scary to many people who are not there at the table and who feel they don't have some input.
Some of the Twitter comments that we're getting tonight have addressed something I think that came up early on, this suburban developer versus an urban developer. How different and how worrisome is it that, of course, he's been working on this for quite some time, so he's not exactly new to it, and he got through the Board of Aldermen, which is a trick in itself, right? But Michael, what about this idea of a cornfield developer coming into city neighborhoods?
Well, frankly, I'm not really worried about what he's going to build because he doesn't know what he's going to build yet. So the renderings he has shown are very urban, they're very attractive. I'm not putting a lot of stock in that either because he's going to have to find partners to build these things, people like Richard Barron or other private developers. What I'm more worried about is the impact of this project on other housing stocks, namely the rest of North St. Louis, parts of South St. Louis. If this project is going to basically pull in all the public incentives for housing development for new construction in a region that has very low demand and housing oversupply, what's going to happen to O'Fallon Park, Walnut Park, the Ville, Gravois Park, and Dutchtown, areas that are struggling to stabilize dense housing stocks and populations?
And we're going to be talking about that with another group in a little bit. Sal, I saw you shaking your head, and I'm not sure which way. It was up and down or back and forth?
Right, and I love Michael Allen. He's a friend of mine. I think
I
development. I think development is development. I mean, there have been a number of suburban developers that have done development in the city of St. Louis. I think it's a market-driven effort. The city of St. Louis has certain standards and design guidelines that any builder that would come in would have to follow. The community has the opportunity to give input on that process to determine, at least in their minds, what they would like for this housing stock to look like. And so I think whatever builders, whatever developers would come in and partner with Paul or be a part of this Northside Regeneration effort, they would be doing the type of development that would satisfy the community's expectations.
Yeah, and I'm looking at, we talked about Mill Creek. That always comes up. Pruitt-Igoe comes up. I said in the piece that for a lot of reasons this isn't Mill Creek, and I think for a lot of reasons it's not Pruitt-Igoe. But tell me why you think it's a relevant thing to bring up at this point.
Well, I think it's relevant because of the amount of public subsidy and the scale of the project. I think
and yet it's not one place. I mean, it's sort of like, people didn't complain, for example, about buying up land for IKEA for, that was a one-spot thing. Pruitt-Igoe was huge.
Right.
Is it thinking big?
Well,
thinking too big is the problem?
I think the problem is thinking about solving social problems like poverty, unemployment, and crime in terms of architecture, in terms of real estate development.
But we are talking jobs too, isn't at least in the meetings, right?
Well, hopefully. But
Right.
and again, I guess there's some discussion to be had about what that really means. Maybe there will be some temporary jobs, maybe there will be some permanent jobs, but will they be jobs for people who are affected by the development? Will those folks, even who are affected by the development, be able to move back into the area, as an example, if they chose to do so? Could they afford to do that? I mean, there's still so many uncertainties about the project, and I think those are the things that keep people a little bit on the edge of their seats because they just don't know. And again, I'm not even sure that Mr. McKee knows. It's a long project, a
Yeah, I think
long-term project. It's a huge project, and I don't know how he could know all of those answers at this point.
Yeah, and I do want to remind people that we're talking about some sort of groundbreakings of work starting in June, but we're really talking about a long-term project and a number of different projects. So there's just so many questions about maybe, again, I always look skeptically at artist conceptions of anything. I also look skeptically at phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 because sometimes we never get past phase 1.
And I think another issue for many people is that issue of control. The control of so much being in the hands of one person. That's frightening.
Yeah, we're going to continue to talk about this. And again, we're getting our Twitter comments. Stay tuned. STL, that's the hashtag. Join us. We'll be right back. One thing I love about Stay Tuned is we don't stay local. I think for us to get a really good sense of what's going on in St. Louis is to talk about it in a national or in an international context. We're not alone in this. A lot of cities face a lot of the same issues and trying a lot of the same things. I'm not sure they're trying this, though. I'm going to talk to Darren Lovass of Urban Solutions Natural Resources Defense Council. It's an advocacy group, and he's coming to us from Maryland. Darren, as you look at this, the North Side Regeneration Project, does it look familiar to you? Does it have some things that look like they might work or that they are doomed to failure, or can you not say?
Well, it's difficult to say. I do see that there is substantial public policy supporting it, the tax increment financing, for example, which is helpful for making sure that infill developments like this one succeed. And I do see that there is a mix of uses, and there's a trolley line planned, which is also familiar. What's new to me, or relatively new, is the stunning scale of the project. 500 acres, thousands of homes, a lot of retail. That is a big project when it comes to infill or redevelopment, and unusually so, I think.
As you look at, and we can talk sort of generally, where do developers, whether it's for a profit motive or for a social motive or whatever, where do they make their biggest mistakes? Or is it just they're the victims of the economy or the politics or whatever? Or is there a common mistake that folks make?
Boy, that's a good question.
Maybe we could talk about the success, right?
Yeah, well, it's easiest, actually, often the path of least resistance for new development is on greenfields, right? In the suburban and exurban areas of regions like St. Louis. It's just easier in terms of the price of the property. It's easier in terms of dealing, not having to deal with potential community opposition, not having to deal with remediation issues if you have pollution from a previous land use. There's a whole bunch of reasons it's easier and less expensive to develop on greenfields way outside of regions like St. Louis. So developing in an infill way and doing redevelopment is much more complicated and can be more expensive. Nowadays, it can be more rewarding, however, because the marketplace pretty clearly is sending the signal that young people especially would like 24-hour living, basically. They want to live in places where they have access to city amenities and urban amenities and more transportation choices. So the marketplace is changing right now to make infill development and redevelopment easier, and it still takes often public policy help to make these projects pencil out. It takes more time, it takes more money, and it takes more working with communities.
Yeah, that's the one issue that has probably come up the most here. And I think a lot of developers or people who are working in those communities said a couple of things. You can't just look at new housing stock. You can't just look at new jobs. You can't just look at better schools. You have to look at all of those things. And I'm not sure all developers are capable of handling all of that. Do they sometimes just look at the shiny new houses and the artist's rendering of what they're going to build and miss the sort of solid foundation of community input?
Yeah, they often do, and that's the development industry and the real estate industry, when it comes to sprawl type development, has a limited number of product lines, whether it be in the residential area or the commercial area, that they rely on, and this is why it often gets dubbed cookie cutter developments, because a lot of it looks very similar. And there's a reason for that. That's what's been profitable. It's become turnkey over the past few decades, really over the past 50 years or more. Now, what's happening with infill and redevelopment sites is more tailoring, and that's where it gets tricky, and that's where it gets interesting. But that's where you also have the potential for really exciting new developments, where you have mixed uses and you have more transportation options. And you really have a chance to revitalize areas. The thing is, though, that it really pays off to work with the community and the neighborhoods and the people who are already living there.
Mm-hmm. How interested, how curious are you in following what happens in St. Louis over the next 10 years with this project?
Oh, I'm fascinated, and I'm not the only one. It sounds like the Department of Housing and Urban Development is interested in the potential outcome in terms of this project in the coming years. And frankly, I do hope it works out. I know that, well, for example, Silver Spring, Maryland, near here, just 20 years ago was a real, well,
Yeah,
I
I
hate
think
to use the
you
word dump.
you bring
It
up
was-
you bring up
It
a
was
point.
it was in poor shape. It was the probably the worst off community in a very wealthy county outside of Washington D.C.
And I'm gonna wrap up with the 20-year part, because I think that's an important point to make. That very often people from the outside looking in, I don't mean you, I mean the community, they want results. I think if this is going to work, in my opinion, it is going to have to be the long haul. And
That's right.
I hope we're all keeping an eye on it. Darren Lovas from Maryland, thanks for joining in and bringing your perspective. Thanks a lot.
very much.
We'll be right back. So the question is really, what's the effect, not within that regeneration area, but in the areas surrounding it? Is there a ripple effect, negative, positive? There's a lot of things going on, and I think some of the concerns that people have been talking about is, does this positively impact the good stuff, or does it start taking away from the things and the progress that people are making? So we've asked Antonio French, the 21st Ward Alderman. Your ward is sort of on the edge of this, is that correct?
It's near. It's a little
Right.
further north.
Right. Rod Jones, who's president and CEO of Grace Hill Settlement House, and Jessica Island, president of Northside Community Housing. So let me ask you this question. What is going to start happening, Rod, is that good for everybody, or is it just good for this regeneration project?
Well, at this point, I think it's too soon to tell. But I suspect that, as you have redevelopment in adjoining neighborhoods, like most cities, that there's some benefit in terms of potential growth, and if it actually results in jobs, then there's economic development for all the people who are close by, if we're prepared to meet those opportunities. And so, as Sal talks about, part of our responsibility in making sure that there's a benefit is that people are trained and prepared to work, that we're doing our level best to make sure that people understand where the implications may be. For example, if a neighborhood starts to develop and the property value goes up, it's not really somebody's individual choice whether taxes go up and those kinds of things happen. And so, I think it can have its benefits along the pathway as long as people are prepared to meet it.
Alderman, when you first started hearing about this, and you probably started hearing about it before the rest of us did, first questions, first concerns, and how have some of those things been addressed?
My first concern is always how it affects the people who live there in that community. I've been following this project for many years before I was an alderman, even back in my blogging days. And so my concern has always been the short-term effect versus the long-term effect. What we've seen in the short term, these last 5 to 7 years, has been a negative effect, frankly. We've seen depopulation. We've seen, as Mr. McKee acquires more property, has not been held accountable to maintain the property. A lot of those blocks have gotten worse in the short run. The question is, how long is the short run? When will we start seeing development? I think a lot of the frustration has been because there's lack of a defined plan. People don't know exactly what the expectations are. And so hopefully, we will see something that benefits not just that area, but the areas around it. The question is, when is that going to happen and what's it going to look like?
Yeah, I want to make sure, we did invite other aldermen. They couldn't all make it. Also remind people that we did invite Paul McKee. He agreed to come and had to cancel. So we're not just sitting around talking about the guy without him knowing it. I'm sure he knows it. Jessica, your response to this, is that a hopeful sense? You guys work hard. All of you are working hard. You don't get a lot of headlines.
Right.
Was the response good because this is good for everybody, or you're taking away from some of the stuff that's already being done here and maybe pushing it aside?
Yeah, well, I would say in our experience with our organization and the communities that we work in, particularly in the Ville and Greater Ville neighborhood, the response has been concerned, as it has been in other areas. And really the concern is, how is this going to impact me and my community, my block, my household? And so as an organization, we try to collaborate as much as possible. We have a mission, which is to provide affordable, high quality, affordable housing to community members, but it really came out of response to community.
Yeah, that seems
more
to be
than 40 years ago.
That's going to be continue to be the issue in this. It's the issue on Twitter tonight. Everybody's saying, where's the gap between the developer and the community? Is the developer listening to the community? The developer's not listening to the community. Let me ask you guys, all of you, is the developer listening to the community?
Well, I mean, I think the ultimate test is going to be if, when the final plan is put together, does it reflect what the people in that community want to see?
Right. And there's going to be lots of final plans, I'm thinking, right?
Well,
or is there one big, massive master plan?
Well, I'd settle for any kind of plan at this point. The frustrating thing is that we've gotten to this point. Huge TIF has been issued, and at least $40 million in state money, tax credit, has already been given to the developer. We've gotten to this point with no plan at all. That is uncommon for development, especially one of this size. And so it breeds some amount of distrust, some amount of confusion about what this is going to mean. And then, of course, the history of the first 2 or 3 years of the project, where it was denial after denial, that it was actually him acquiring the property, and people have seen the condition of the property. So it doesn't do a lot to build trust. And so Mr. McKee has a lot of work to do in that regard.
Is that work being done? How do you do it? How do you come in, whether you're a social worker or a housing expert or a health expert, you want to be able to make some change. How do you get that community to become a part of that and feel some ownership? Or is that even possible with a big developer? But let me just start with what you do. How do you get that community to trust who you are and what you're trying to do?
Well, in our case, our organization began out of St. Matthew's Church more than 30 years ago. And it was really in response to what the community said they needed. They were working with seniors, and there was a big need for housing that was affordable, but still high quality. So we respond to what the community says, as opposed to coming to them and saying, hey, we have some funds to do this, and this is a good location to do it. So I think that's a big part of it, is really assessing what is it that the community is saying is a concern, and being responsive to that, and also keeping them engaged, like not only through the planning process, but throughout the many years afterwards. And I think that's actually going to be a test of how this project will go, because in the planning phase, that's important. And I mean, it is interesting that hasn't occurred prior to now to the level that we would expect for a project at this scale.
Yeah, what kind of advice? Is this advice to a developer like Paul
Yes,
McKee? How do you get into what kind of
exactly.
advice, if you were hired to be his PR guy or his community rep, how would you say, this is what we need to do, Paul, if you're going to win these people over?
Well, I've had a couple conversations with Paul about it, and so I think that my general advice is always, as our organization, we've been for 110 years working in neighborhoods with communities, that people are well capable of articulating what it is that they think and they see, and there's always a balance between what people want and what you can afford or what you can buy. But a key part of it is making sure that you're able to have power with people, meaning that you're able to articulate to people all sides of the coin, and then to be honest with people about what they can have and can't have. I think the other part of engagement...
People have to see where they're going to win in this. Are they going to get something out of it, right? I mean, right now they're worried about what they're going to lose.
Well, right now what they're concerned about is the condition of the neighborhood. The folks that have to live next door to some of these properties right now have been asking and want to see those properties stabilized, some of the lots trimmed, maintained, fenced in. And they are frustrated after $40 million of state tax credit money already given. They expected to see something, at least the lawns being maintained.
Yeah. Yeah. Very quickly, best case, worst case scenario for you on this project?
Well, the best case is that Mr. McKee's promises turn out to be true, that we will see large-scale development in North St. Louis, that area repopulated, and a lot of the people who are there will find a place to stay there and be rewarded. Worst case scenario is that the only thing that has been assured so far is that Paul McKee has found a way to be reimbursed for demolition. And so if we continue to subsidize large-scale demolition in that area, a lot of people are acting under the belief that it can't get worse. It can get worse.
Yeah, very quickly, yes or no, will there continue to be issues in the Board of Aldermen that he's going to have to get through?
I'm sure as he continues to miss deadlines, he'll have to come back to us and ask for an extension.
And you're going to be looking for some indication that it's working?
I'm going to keep looking for that plan.
Great. Stick around. We're going to continue this in just a moment. Okay, so what we keep hearing on Twitter and what we keep hearing throughout in the coverage of this particular story is community, community, community. Where are they? What is their role? Todd Swanstrom is with the UMSL Public Policy Research Center. You've been here before, so we've asked you back. Natalie Self is with Beyond Housing, doing a lot of work in a lot of communities. Community, community, community. What are we, let me ask this, what are we missing in this at this point? I mean, what do we need to know about this project and these? I don't think there's a single community in the regeneration area. I think there's a number of communities. What do we need to know about that?
Well, I think this is a big project and kind of can blot out a lot of what's happening on the ground. You know, what's happening in the St. Louis region is there are revitalization efforts bubbling up all over St. Louis City and county and across the region. And I think, you know, any project like this has to build on what's there. It's called asset-based community development, ABCD, right, Natalie?
Absolutely.
And, you know, you work with what's there and
Is
you
that what
build
people
up
call
from
an
that.
organic sort
Exactly.
of project
Yeah,
that comes
yeah.
out of the community?
I mean, I don't want to romanticize bottom up. You need the top, you need the grass tops as well as the grass roots, right? But you have to work with community and it's painstaking to build from the bottom. And I think there's a lot of good things happening in the region.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what's interesting about the region, in particular with this project, is that community development is so diverse in St. Louis. This is almost sort of on one end of a spectrum. And then on the other end of a spectrum, both in terms of size of development, but also models might be organizations like Beyond Housing. So we follow a process called Ask, Align, and Act. And so similar to what some of the other panelists were saying in the previous session, we start by asking. We go into places where we're invited, and so our model is just very different.
But you're not a developer, although you do some development. I mean, you've built some stuff.
Well,
We are
Yeah.
a nonprofit organization that does development. We started 40 years ago with
Right.
housing and
Yeah.
affordable housing, and have moved to larger scale commercial development, affordable grocery stores, full service banks. We're actually about to break ground on
But
a
do you
health.
sneak around doing it?
No,
Like-
well, that's not our model.
Okay.
We start with the community and we ask them what they want to see.
Right.
Not only that, but I think it's interesting in the case of Beyond Housing and the 24-1 initiative, and they're doing work at
In the Normandy, Pagedale?
Normandy,
yeah.
Pagedale area, doing work at the Rock Road TOD station. I've been told they're not going to use eminent domain, and they're just facing the fact that they might have to spend a little bit more to purchase property when people don't want to sell it at a certain point in time. So they're just, in order to really be transparent and to be honest with the community, they're going to have to spend more money. Now, in some ways, that kind of rubs me the wrong way, but on the other hand, that shows that what's important is that they be upfront with the community from the get-go. And the other thing is, you know, real community participation means not that you bring the plan to the community and say, what do you think? You sit down with the community and say, what's on your mind? What are you thinking about for this community first to set the agenda?
But when you have something this big, and this was something we were talking about just a little bit ago, do you feel like the pot is now in somebody else's, you know, place, that the ability to do, for other organizations to do developments in other areas is going to be lessened, is it going to be hurt? Or is this not that kind of a, you know, game? Is there plenty for everybody to do whatever they want to do?
As an organization, I mean, we feel strongly that there are assets in every community. There's always opportunity. You have to be creative sometimes. You certainly have to be respectful. So I personally would feel like that may not be a conversation I would agree with, but you know, from a scholarly point of view, Todd, I don't know where you
stand. Well, I mean, I agree with Natalie. I mean, I think it's not a zero-sum game. I mean, I'd like to see Paul McKee succeed. I mean, I'm very much supportive of what's going to happen. And I think if he succeeds, we're all going to do better.
Well, the talk is right, because he's not just talking about building some houses. He's also talking about building a grocery store. He's talking about creating jobs. There's some promises about who gets those jobs. So it's economic, it's residential, it's environmental.
Well, that shows you, I think, what really is at stake here, is especially when you're working in a community that has the disadvantages that parts of the north side have, the disinvestment, loss of population. You can't just do one thing. You've got to do all those things. And so it's very, very complicated. When you work in other communities, I work with the Community Builders Network. It's a coalition of about 30 community development groups on the ground. Some of them are working in communities where really they just need a grocery store. I mean, that's the problem, right? They've got other things, you know. But here in this case, you've got to do all these things. And so I think people have to be patient. I think they have to understand that this is painstaking. You have to weave the fabric together to make great cities. You can't just come in and build a building and think that that's going to do the job.
Some of the comments have been, I think, why is this guy getting so much guff for coming in and trying to do something? Now, I know there are other organizations that are doing things in there, but why is he getting this much for trying to do something? When you think back, for example, with remember the Team 4 plan, right? The triage. Well, we won't put money in those neighborhoods because they're not. We can't save them, so we'll put money in the West End. And people were outraged. Now they're outraged because somebody says, "I want to put money into this neighborhood."
Well, I think he's filling a gap here, a vacuum here, right? I mean, if you look at, there's a redevelopment local land bank in the city of St. Louis, which has accumulated properties. It's one of the first land banks in the United States. It was a real step forward when it was created, but it has no funds to really plan and really do it, implement it. Instead, it tries to sell individual properties.
Right.
So Paul McKee, and I think he's very sincere, is trying to step into that gap, but he's stepping into a really big, difficult situation, right? And it's a difficult situation also because he's a private developer. It's not a public. I mean, in the case of Beyond Housing, they're working with Pagedale. They're a nonprofit. I mean, there's a little. It's a little easier. It's something you can get your hands around.
And yet, the toughest stories, the harshest memories are the public projects. Mill Creek.
That's for sure.
Pruitt-Igoe.
That's for sure.
And when St. Louis thought big now. So here's a private, although there's public funding in it. Well, here's a private developer, and he's not.
I think
what's the difference?
I want to encourage us to continue to think big. It's, for me, not about what the project looks like, it's about how we approach the project. And so with Beyond Housing and 24/1, we have 24 municipalities that are working together. That's approximately 40,000 residents. That's a big project. For us, what's been successful is that we were very intentional with our process. Again, we asked people what they wanted to see, and we focused on quick wins. And I think organizations like Paul McKee's would benefit from some quick wins on the community development side.
That's right.
We're going to ask some of the other folks to come back in, but I want to keep talking about that because I think the 24/1 project was that idea that you've got to go top to bottom in a development? You know, you talk about housing, it's not just houses, right?
It's not just housing, and residents were the ones that identified the topics that were important to them, and it was everything from housing, economic development, you know, health, job readiness, early childhood, post-secondary, you know, all factors of it. And it's important.
But you have to set up a process for that. And I wonder if Paul McKee has that process in place.
Well, you know,
yet.
the problem here, Jim, is we're talking about this person, Paul McKee. It's not about Paul
Right.
McKee. It's about complex relationships. And, you know, if we're trying to figure out what's in Paul McKee's head, then we're not in the right place. We got to figure out all of the different stakeholders and actors in the community, get them around the table and make things happen.
Well, and what's going to be critical, I would surmise, for the success of this development is what we all know: partnerships. You know, no organization, no individual can do something all by themselves. Beyond Housing succeeds because we form critical partnerships with organizations that have a track record of being successful and respectful to the community. And I think that's a key to all of our work.
Is he doing that? Anybody see? You know, maybe he's just setting the stage, and these things need to follow. I mean, I just, you know, Tim, I'm wondering as you follow this, what, you know, you can talk about the groundbreakings and stuff like that and the projects. What should we all be? Let me ask you this: what am I missing in all of this? But what should we really be looking for that would be signs of success or going off in the wrong direction? I'll leave that up to you guys because I bet you have some ideas.
I think at some level we must really always be careful not to pass the wrong responsibility to the wrong people. And so part of what we, the collective us, even at this table have to think about is when we talk about allowing people to participate, when growth comes, there are certain implications there. If jobs come, we have to make sure that people are ready to participate and work. If there is growth, ultimately what you'll find is that taxes will rise, property taxes will rise, property value will rise. Are people able to manage the finances under those things? And that's not left to a developer. That's our partnerships. That's the collective work of those of us who do this work every day in those communities.
Yeah. You know, I think it's important at the very beginning here to define what success would be. You know, is success we flattened it and build big box stores and people who used to live in these neighborhoods don't live there anymore? Is that success where I can go and shop at a Target down there now? Or is it success where we're building neighborhoods and making it a place where the folks who are there are willing to stay and raise their families and more people are coming to join them? I think that's success.
And along those lines, I would say too, we want to encourage those community members to actually be able to invest in their own community and not just wait for an investor to come and build and develop, but actually how can these community members themselves find, how can we support them in investing and staying long term and becoming homeowners and supporting the growth of their community long term.
And I think success.
The whole issue of not only just home ownership, but business ownership as well, small businesses. I mean, I came from a community where small mom and pop stores and businesses flourished. And that, I think, is an important part of any development, particularly one that is this large. There should be a space in that project where it encourages home ownership, it encourages small business development, and it has some resources in place that will help that happen. Without that, I don't think a project can even begin to think about success. I haven't heard discussions about that as we've talked about and been to public meetings. I've heard about industrial and commercial and infrastructure and housing, but none of the other things that really are people-oriented, as in my perspective, people-oriented. How will people benefit from what's going to happen?
And the research on collective impact and community development and otherwise shows that if things are not intentionally planned for, they will not happen.
Exactly.
So we cannot assume that just because new businesses come in, that our residents will get the jobs, will be prepared for the jobs. So intentionality in developing both people and places, which is something that you often talk about, will be critical to the success of any community development project.
I think all these issues we talked about today are in place. As I said earlier today, I was just in a meeting today with Paul, with the members of the Northside Regeneration Workforce Coalition. I have relationships with all the organizations at this table. The implementation will be key, but the components are in place. We just have to move forward and be very vigilant and very serious about partnership in this community. But these things are in place. They've been presented, they're part of the plan, and we're going down the road of partnership. So I'm very optimistic about the implementation of Northside Regeneration.
And I think that success to me, I just want to look bigger and broader than this project. It's looking at these structural failures in our city government that this project sort of bucked against. So everybody from the community to Paul McKee complains about, well, there wasn't the framework for good planning, and someone like McKee had to come in here. And then elected officials in turn said, well, we have to dream big. Well, I want to see elected officials in city government dream as big for the Land Revitalization Authority and its future, and for urban planning and for the planning department as they do for Paul McKee. If this is inevitable and these bills are passing 25-2 to do something on this scale, why can't we put the same political weight behind the structural components we need to avoid this sort of mess again?
Well, I mean, the fact is that Paul McKee, is one of the largest campaign donors. He has a machine in place to be able to make City Hall work for him. It's not something that most developers have. It's not that most small business people have. And through his buying and through his politics, he's become the big fish there. And so he has a lot of the leverage now. There was a time some years ago, you remember, where there was more opposition from elected officials, but
how did that happen?
He owns so much of that area now that it's almost too big to fail in a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, this is a trend happening in cities around the country where you have wealthy individuals really taking over the functions of government, and in some ways you have to give them, you have to cheer them on, right? At least they're stepping into a gap. But on the other hand, to me, it's worrisome if it doesn't, because we don't have the right to the information. We don't have rights to know about what's going on behind the scenes when a private developer owns the land. If it's a public agency, there are certain protections. So it's something that's happening in Detroit, in Seattle. New York had Mayor Bloomberg, who himself was a billionaire who would give hundreds of millions of dollars to urban projects. So we're entering a new era, and I think we have to have ways to hold it accountable.
Yeah, I wonder if we're better off, and in a general sense, of somebody trying to make money as opposed to a nonprofit trying to do good work. No offense to the nonprofits like ourselves who are trying to do good work.
Well, the problem, though, is that if profit
and by
alone,
the way, we're gonna continue this discussion online at 9net.org. So you guys keep talking,
right.
and at home, if you want to follow it, just go online.
The problem, though, is that if profit alone is driving development, especially on this large a scale, I think that's a problem. And if so many of these decisions can be made in private without public consideration or public involvement, that's a problem.
Yeah, but in conjunction with smart planning, with civic engagement, with grassroots organizations, and social services, like the kind that Rod provides, then it can become really synergistic, right? And really transform.
I think too, I wonder if somebody coming in and making a lot of people angry or having a lot of distrust, there isn't some advantage to people saying, hey, we want a voice here, and getting involved in a way that maybe they wouldn't have gotten involved before.
Another benefit, I believe, is that smaller nonprofit developers like our organization, we're now looking at, how can we do something on a larger scale like that in partnership with others that have the intention of making a profit to invest back in the community as opposed to put in our own pockets. And so, and from our perspective, in some ways it does make you wake up and say, you know what, there should be something happening on a bigger scale here. And we shouldn't wait for a private developer to come and drive that. So.
Well, and again, I would contend, and I think Beyond Housing and a number of the other community development organizations in the St. Louis region would contend that really where you need to focus is on process and where you start. Community members are human beings. Everybody has needs, wants, dreams, desires. People understand that you need to pay the bills, whether it's the salaries of the employees at your organization, or if you want to make a little bit of money. And people understand if you're authentic, if you're real. People can smell BS a mile away. But if you're genuinely authentic and come to a table and say, Todd, I'm a for-profit developer, but I'm interested in this, and this is why it might make sense to me. Would you be willing to engage with me? What would you like to see? I'm convinced that could lead to success in a big way.
We brought up a couple of things when we was talking about the Target store, right? I mean, there's a lot of people who'd love to have a Target store somewhere nearby. That in some ways is a good thing, unless it's
not where my house is.
Not unless it's where your house is. And you talked about mom and pop stores in the neighborhoods. Is that again? That seems to be the mom and pop thing, especially seems to be much more organic. How does that develop? How does that work successfully? I don't mean as an individual. There's one store. I mean, we saw, the beauty shop was there, but it replaced the market that went out of business. Not replaced, but there was a balance there. How does that
That's
happen?
what you're looking for, is the balance. You're looking for a combination of things, not all big business, not all big industries, not all things that lend themselves well to people with money. You're looking for things. I know at one of the sessions, Mr. McKee talked about his interest and his commitment to diversity in the developing community. Well, I don't think you have that diversity, or you can achieve that diversity unless you have all of those little components.
What about density?
Well, I think
density is no? Density's
no,
not an issue?
I agree, but I was just going to say with regard to business, I mean, if the north side tries to compete with the suburbs and just has try the big shopping center and the big box and everything,
We've done
they're going
that.
to lose. They're going to lose. You
At
need
St.
to have,
Louis Center,
you
we
have
had-
something that's
yeah.
distinctive, something that's different. People like to have this. It can be obviously it can be some big businesses, but you've got to weave in the small mom and pops that are interesting.
It has to be
the
urban,
cafes
doesn't
and
it? Have to
coffee
be
shops
urban,
and
whatever
everything.
that means.
That can happen. If you look at what's happening in Crown Square in the old North St. Louis
Right.
neighborhood, number of new businesses have relocated to Crown Square. They feel the positive momentum of what's happening in that community. People have moved in, people have set up shop, and you have all types of businesses there that are hiring people, that are offering goods and services to the community. So we've seen it happen just very close proximity to this area, and so there's no reason to think that can't be replicated.
There's even some cultural institutions on the 14th Street District. There's some cultural institutions. Again, some artistic people there. Again, those are things that make a community in my estimation.
14th Street is a dense concentration of pedestrian-scale historic buildings, spaces that are ultimately affordable to small businesses. And that's why people like myself in the preservation world are sometimes so fierce about tearing down building stock and about McKee's early activities, because it's not so much that every building is important or architecturally significant. It's like that's a place that somebody could afford to open a small business in. That's built at a scale that's accessible to humans on foot.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things, because to me, what distinguishes the urban environment from the suburban environment is the built environment, and so much has been lost.
Don't see a lot of small businesses in new buildings.
I do think that we have to be careful not to be aesthetic on the surface. I think a big part of small business in communities, and we run the Regional Small Business Development Center, is about creating the cyclical nature of a dollar in communities. And what we know in most minority communities is a dollar barely cycles once. And so without that happening, there is no long-term growth and sustainability. And so I think we again, for those of us who work in those communities, have lived this over and over again and have to guard against. And it's not the developer's responsibility, it's our responsibility to make sure that those things occur, because we know that they're there and that they're unintended consequences.
But can you work within what Paul McKee wants to do? I think that's the question. I think for everybody, right?
He's willing to have us work
Right.
within it. I think we, certainly those of us sitting around this table, are anxious for the opportunity to work with him in just that way. And I think it's crucial to the success of his project that we do so. I was going to say earlier, just as an example, we're talking about large, beautiful buildings as opposed. Our building is a building built in 1916. It's a beautiful building. We are struggling to do renovations on a small scale, step by step. We could never go and build a state-of-the-art new museum facility. Mr. McKee probably could, or he could use his resources to do it. We couldn't do that. But I think there is a value to the community of having that kind of institution in the heart of a project like this, in the middle of a project like this. And I think it behooves developers, whoever they are, to make sure that those kinds of things have some sustainability and that they grow with the projects. I think that's what we are all kind of hoping will happen with the project.
I agree with that whole.
I'll give you guys the last word over here.
Well,
Go
I
ahead.
was going to say, what the phrase that's sometimes used is patient capital. Capital is patient, that doesn't just want to jump in and lay something on the ground, but can work patiently over time. And when I'm looking around the room at people who work in community development, they've been doing it for 10, 15, 20 years. It's really tough work. And I think some private developers think, if you have a greenfield site and you put it up and you have a sort of cookie cutter methodology, and they do that well, by the way. But if you're going to work in this environment, you're going to have to really weave the warp and the woof together, the city, to make it work. And it's long, painstaking work. And it's a different orientation, I think, that a lot of private sector developers are not used to that, right?
And Tim, he's talking what, 10, 15 years? What does he talk about?
15, 20 years, long
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, that's
so.
right.